In the quiet town of Union, South Carolina, a chilling crime unfolded in the fall of 1994 that would forever mark American criminal history. The case of Susan Smith, a young mother who fabricated a story of a carjacking and the abduction of her two small sons, only to later confess to their murder, became one of the most haunting examples of maternal filicide in modern times. It was a case that riveted the nation, drawing intense media coverage and sparking debates about motherhood, mental health, race, and justice. When Smith first appeared before cameras, tearfully pleading for the safe return of her children, the public rallied to her side. The image of a devastated mother begging for the release of her babies triggered sympathy across the United States. But as days passed, inconsistencies in her account began to surface. What was initially viewed as a shocking tragedy involving a stranger's violence turned into something far darker and more unsettling. The truth, once revealed, was almost too terrible to comprehend. Smith had strapped her 3-year-old son Michael and 14-month-old son Alexander into their car seats, driven to a lake, and released the handbrake, allowing the vehicle to roll into the dark water. The boys drowned, still buckled into their seats, as their mother watched. This article will examine the Susan Smith case in exhaustive detail. It will trace her life and psychological background, explore the crime and its aftermath, analyze the trial, and consider the cultural impact that continues nearly 3 decades later. By looking deeply into the story, we can better understand not only the individual tragedy, but also what it revealed about American society in the 1990s. Susan Leigh Vaughan was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina. Her childhood, though seemingly ordinary on the surface, was marked by instability, trauma, and emotional turmoil. When she was 6 years old, her parents divorced, a rupture that deeply affected her sense of security. Her father later died by suicide when Susan was a teenager, leaving behind a wound that would never fully heal. Growing up, Susan's home life was complicated. Her mother remarried, but Susan's relationship with her stepfather was strained. Years later, allegations would emerge that her stepfather had sexually abused her, adding another layer of trauma to her already troubled adolescence. Though the details remained debated, the atmosphere of dysfunction was undeniable. As a student, Susan was remembered as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, and struggling with feelings of inadequacy. Teachers and classmates described her as a girl who longed for acceptance but often seemed lost. She was not at the top of her class, nor was she a consistent troublemaker, but she carried emotional scars that influenced her behavior in subtle but significant ways. By her late teens, Susan was already battling depression and thoughts of self-harm. She attempted suicide more than once, early signs of her fragile mental state. Her relationships with men were also marked by volatility, longing, and insecurity. In this sense, the seeds of future tragedy were being planted. In 1989, at the age of 18, Susan began dating David Smith, a man from her hometown. Their relationship moved quickly, and by 1991, the two were married. Soon after, they welcomed their first son, Michael, in 1991, and their second son, Alexander, in 1993. From the outside, it may have looked like Susan had settled into the traditional role of wife and mother, but inside the marriage, things were far from stable. Both Susan and David struggled with infidelity, jealousy, and financial difficulties. The young couple often fought, and their union was described by friends as passionate but turbulent. For Susan, motherhood was a complex experience. She loved her sons, but she also felt overwhelmed, trapped, and unfulfilled. The demands of raising 2 young children, coupled with marital discord and her own psychological struggles, weighed heavily on her. She oscillated between moments of deep affection for her boys and episodes of detachment, where she seemed unable to fully engage in her maternal role. By 1994, the marriage had broken down, and Susan and David separated. This separation further destabilized Susan's life, leaving her vulnerable, isolated, and desperate for validation. It was in this context that she became romantically involved with another man, Tom Findlay, the son of a wealthy local business owner. Susan's relationship with Tom Findlay was passionate but ultimately one-sided. Tom enjoyed Susan's company but did not share her vision of a future together, especially one that included her children. He came from privilege, and his lifestyle did not align with the responsibilities of becoming a stepfather to 2 young boys. In October 1994, Tom broke things off with Susan, writing her a letter that made clear he did not want to pursue a long-term relationship with her. Crucially, the letter also suggested that he did not envision a life with her children in the picture. For Susan, this rejection was devastating. It compounded her feelings of abandonment, rejection, and worthlessness. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Susan was described as erratic, emotional, and visibly distraught. Friends and coworkers noticed her instability. At the same time, she longed to rekindle her romance with Tom and fantasized about a future where he might accept her. The children, in her fractured mental state, became obstacles to that imagined life. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith strapped her 2 children, Michael and Alexander, into their car seats. She then drove through the small town of Union, South Carolina, and headed toward a rural area that she knew well. Her destination was John D. Long Lake, a quiet body of water surrounded by woods and dirt roads. At around 9:30 p.m., Susan claimed that she stopped at a traffic light. According to her original story, a black man approached her car, forced her out, and sped away with her 2 sons still inside. This account would later prove to be a fabrication, but at that moment, it set off a chain of events that gripped the nation. In reality, Susan drove her Mazda to the edge of the lake, shifted the car into neutral, and released the handbrake. The car, with her sons trapped inside, rolled slowly down the ramp and into the dark, cold water. As the headlights disappeared beneath the surface, Michael and Alexander were left helpless, still buckled into their seats. They drowned while their mother stood by, watching the vehicle sink into the lake. Moments after the crime, Susan ran to the nearest house and frantically claimed that she had been carjacked. Her voice shook as she described the supposed kidnapper, a black man who had overpowered her and driven away with her children. Her story triggered immediate sympathy and concern. Within hours, local police began their search. They issued an Amber Alert, set up roadblocks, and broadcast descriptions of the car across the state. Volunteers organized search parties, while the FBI was brought in to assist. The Union community, largely tight-knit and religious, poured its energy into finding Michael and Alexander. Susan appeared on television the next day, pleading for her children a safe return. With tears streaming down her face, she begged the alleged kidnapper to release her sons. The image of a distraught young mother resonated deeply with viewers, who offered prayers, donations, and support. However, beneath the tears, investigators began to notice subtle cracks in Susan's story. Her timeline was inconsistent. Her description of the alleged carjacker changed slightly with each telling, and the emotional intensity she displayed seemed to fluctuate in unusual ways. For 9 days, the case dominated national headlines. Major television networks provided constant updates, while newspapers published front-page stories about the missing boys. The fact that Susan claimed a black man had committed the crime carried heavy racial implications, especially in the South. Authorities circulated composite sketches, and innocent black men in Union faced harassment and suspicion. Meanwhile, Susan played the role of grieving mother in front of cameras. She tended vigils, accepted community support, and held hands with family members as they prayed for the safe return of her children. The country watched in sympathy, believing they were witnessing the cruel aftermath of a random act of violence. But detectives were not convinced. They examined Susan's body language, her contradictions, and her personal history. They learned about her troubled marriage, her affair with Tom Findlay, and the recent letter that made clear he did not want children in his life. Gradually, suspicion shifted from an unknown assailant to Susan herself. Union police, along with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division SLED, pressed Susan for details. Her answers often seemed vague or rehearsed. Detectives noticed that she avoided eye contact when asked pointed questions. They also examined the geography of her story. The traffic light where she claimed to have been carjacked did not operate on a timer at that hour, contradicting her version of events. The pressure on Susan mounted. She grew increasingly nervous during interviews. Officers observed her fluctuating between tears and calmness in ways that seemed unnatural. Finally, investigators confronted her with the inconsistencies. They told her they believed she was withholding the truth. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the alleged abduction, Susan broke down. Through sobs, she confessed to fabricating the carjacking story. She admitted that she had driven her car into John D. Law Lake with her sons inside. The revelation shocked the nation. The very woman who had been portrayed as a heartbroken mother had in fact orchestrated the deaths of her own children. The confession instantly turned public sympathy into outrage. Authorities rushed to John Dead Long Lake, where divers located the submerged vehicle. The car was found about 20 feet below the surface, with both children still strapped in their car seats. Michael and Alexander were pronounced dead at the scene. Images of the car being pulled from the water circulated worldwide. It was a haunting visual that symbolized the betrayal of maternal trust. For many Americans, it was almost impossible to reconcile the image of Susan's tearful pleas with the brutal reality of what she had done. The community of Union was devastated. Vigils turned from hopeful gatherings to mourning ceremonies. Anger mixed with grief, as residents struggled to process how a mother could commit such an act. Almost immediately, the racial element of the fabricated story drew criticism. By falsely accusing a black man, Susan had not only misled investigators but also endangered innocent members of her community. Civil rights leaders condemned her actions, highlighting how easily stereotypes about black criminality had been exploited. Nationally, the case became a cultural flashpoint. Talk shows, newspapers, and magazines dissected every detail. Psychologists were interviewed about why mothers kill their children. Commentators debated whether Susan was evil, mentally ill, or a victim of her own circumstances. The horror of the crime and the betrayal of trust ensured that the Susan Smith case would never fade quickly from memory. After her confession, Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder. Her trial became one of the most closely followed courtroom dramas of the 1990s. The sheer brutality of the crime, combined with her public deception, made the proceedings both sensational and deeply emotional. The courtroom in Union County was packed each day with journalists, local residents, and curious spectators. National networks sent crews to provide live coverage. For many Americans, the trial was not just about one woman's crime, but also about broader questions of motherhood, morality, and mental health. The prosecution argued that Susan had deliberately killed her children to remove what she saw as obstacles to her romantic ambitions. They pointed to her affair with Tom Findlay, the letter in which he expressed disinterest in raising children, and her fragile emotional state at the time. Prosecutors painted her as selfish, calculating, and manipulative. The defense, led by attorney David Bruck, took a very different approach. They acknowledged the crime but sought to explain it through Susan's history of trauma, depression, and mental instability. They argued that she was not an inherently evil woman but a deeply troubled one, overwhelmed by rejection, loneliness, unresolved psychological scars. During the trial, witnesses described Susan's erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murders. Some testified that she appeared distraught after her breakup with Tom Findlay. Others recalled that she had seemed unable to manage her emotions, oscillating between hope, despair, and impulsiveness. The most powerful moments came when evidence about the children's final moments was presented. Jurors listened as experts explained how Michael and Alexander drowned, strapped helplessly in their car seats. The image of their last moments was almost unbearable. Some jurors later admitted they struggled to hold back tears. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the coldness of Susan's actions. She not only let the car roll into the lake, but then lied for 9 days, allowing the nation to search desperately for children she knew were already dead. Her lies, they argued, compounded her guilt. The defense countered by highlighting Susan's mental health struggles. They pointed to her father as suicide, her history of sexual abuse by her stepfather, and her repeated suicide attempts. They portrayed her as a woman spiraling out of control, more pitiful than monstrous. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some carried signs demanding the death penalty. Others expressed sorrow for Susan, believing she was more a victim of mental illness than a cold-blooded killer. The media intensified public opinion. Talk shows debated whether Susan Smith should live or die. Newspapers featured editorials reflecting both outrage and sympathy. The case divided the nation, as some demanded harsh punishment while others pleaded for mercy. For many, the fact that Susan falsely accused a black man added another layer of anger. In an already racially tense society, her lie reignited conversations about prejudice, scapegoating, and the dangers of racial profiling. This aspect of the case ensured that it was not only about one family's tragedy but also about systemic issues in American culture. On July 22, 1995, After weeks of testimony and emotional arguments, the jury delivered its verdict. Susan Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. The question then became whether she would face the death penalty or life imprisonment. The prosecution pushed for execution, citing the cruelty of drowning 2 innocent children. They argued the deaths were premeditated and motivated by selfish desires. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment, urging jurors to recognize her mental fragility and tragic background. In the end, the jury chose mercy. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. This meant that she would be eligible for parole in 2024. The decision was controversial. Some believed she had escaped the ultimate punishment. Others felt that spending decades in prison, haunted by her actions, was a more fitting consequence. Following her sentencing, Susan Smith was sent to the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. Her life behind bars was far from quiet. Over the years, reports emerged of disciplinary problems, rule violations, and inappropriate relationships with prison guards. Inmates and staff described her as manipulative and attention-seeking. She was disciplined for drug use, sexual encounters, and self-harming behavior. These incidents reinforced the perception that Susan continued to struggle with emotional instability and poor judgment. Despite these problems, Susan maintained periodic contact with her family. Her mother continued to visit her, while her ex-husband, David Smith, largely kept his distance. David publicly stated that he could never forgive her for killing their children, though he expressed sorrow for the broken woman she had become. As her parole eligibility date approaches, public interest in her case is reignited. Many Americans remain adamant that she should never be released, believing that her crime was too horrific to warrant freedom. Others argue that decades of imprisonment may have served as sufficient punishment, though this view is far less common. The Susan Smith trial left an enduring mark on American culture. It raised questions about maternal instincts, the pressures of single motherhood, and the devastating impact of untreated mental illness. It also exposed how societal prejudices can be exploited, as seen in her false accusation against a black man. For psychologists, the case became a reference point in the study of filicide. For journalists, it was a cautionary tale about media manipulation and the dangers of uncritical sympathy. For ordinary Americans, it remained a story almost too painful to process, one that continues to evoke anger and sadness decades later. From the moment Susan Smith reported the alleged carjacking, the media seized upon the story. News anchors delivered breathless updates, while local stations broadcast live footage of search parties and prayer vigils. The image of Susan's tear-streaked face, pleading for her children's return, became one of the most replayed clips of the 1990s. For 9 days, the nation was united in sympathy. Strangers mailed donations, offered tips, and wrote letters of encouragement. Churches across South Carolina held special services, praying for Michael and Alexander's safe return. But when Susan confessed, the narrative flipped overnight. The same journalists who had championed her as a grieving mother now condemned her as a liar and murderer. Headlines that once read "Mother begs for children's safe return" were replaced with "Monster Mom confesses." This whiplash captured the public's attention even more. Americans were stunned not only by the crime itself but also by the sheer deception involved. The betrayal of trust, a mother turning against her children and an entire country, became the focal point of coverage. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was Susan's decision to blame a fictitious black man for the abduction. In a region still grappling with racial tension, this false accusation had dangerous consequences. Police stopped and questioned innocent black men. Community members felt targeted and vilified. Civil rights leaders quickly denounced Susan's lie. They pointed out that her false claim reinforced damaging stereotypes of black men as violent criminals. The case reignited conversations about racial profiling, systemic bias, and how easily prejudice could be weaponized. For many, this aspect of the case was as disturbing as the murders themselves. It showed how ingrained racial fears could be manipulated for personal gain. Susan's lie served as a stark reminder that justice systems and communities often operate within racialized frameworks. Psychologists and criminologists were deeply engaged in analyzing Susan Smith's motives. Crime raised painful questions. How could a mother kill her own children? Was she purely evil? Or was there a deeper psychological explanation? Experts pointed to her history of trauma, the suicide of her father, allegations of sexual abuse by her stepfather, and her struggles with depression all contributed to a fractured psyche. Her repeated suicide attempts suggested a pattern of emotional instability. Some theorists argued that Susan's act represented a form of altruistic filicide, where mothers kill their children believing it will relieve them from suffering. But in Susan's case, the evidence leaned more toward selfish motives, the desire to be free of responsibility, to win back a lover, and to start anew. Still, even selfish motives are rooted in psychological turmoil. Susan's fragile sense of identity, compounded by rejection and loneliness, may have created a distorted logic. In her desperate mind, eliminating her children appeared as a path to reclaiming love and control. The case also became a touchstone for examining postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. While Susan was not officially diagnosed with either, the broader conversation highlighted how society often overlooks the mental health of mothers. The Susan Smith case became more than a true crime story. It was a cultural phenomenon that revealed deep anxieties about family, gender roles, and morality in the United States. In the 1990s, the image of the good mother was still idealized. Mothers were expected to be selfless, nurturing, and protective at all costs. Susan's crime shattered that image in the most brutal way possible. The betrayal was not just personal but symbolic. If a mother could kill her own children, what did that say about the sanctity of family values in America? The case sparked debates on television talk shows, in university classrooms, and around dinner tables. It also influenced popular culture. The case was featured in documentaries, books, and television dramatizations. It joined the ranks of other infamous cases, like Andrea Yates and Casey Anthony, in shaping public perception of maternal filicide. For true crime enthusiasts, the case became a grim staple. For psychologists, it remained a case study in the complexity of human behavior. For many ordinary Americans, it was simply a tragedy they could never fully understand. Amid the focus on Susan, it was easy to forget the true victims, Michael and Alexander. Friends and family described Michael as an energetic 3-year-old who loved to laugh and explore. Alexander, only 14 months old, was a happy baby with bright eyes and a gentle spirit. Their short lives were cut off before they had a chance to grow. In Union, memorials were built to honor them, including a monument at John D. Long Lake? Visitors often leave flowers, stuffed animals, and notes to this day. The community continues to grieve, not only for the boys but for the betrayal that robbed them of their innocence. The tragedy remains etched in Union's collective memory, serving as a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. Nearly 3 decades later, the Susan Smith case still resonates. It is remembered not only for its brutality but also for the questions it forced society to confront. It revealed the dangers of unchecked prejudice when Susan fabricated a black suspect. It highlighted the fragility of human psychology and the catastrophic consequences of untreated trauma. It shattered illusions about motherhood, forcing Americans to acknowledge that even maternal love can be corrupted by despair, selfishness, and mental illness. Most importantly, it underscored the need to remember the victims. Michael and Alexander's lives were short, but their memory continues to remind us of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and justice. The story of Susan Smith is not just about one woman's crime. It is about a society reckoning with its deepest fears about family, about trust, and about the darkness that sometimes hides behind familiar faces. Since entering Lyth Correctional Institution in 1995, Susan Smith has lived a life of confinement marked by controversy. Reports from prison records reveal multiple disciplinary issues, including inappropriate relationships with guards, drug use, and self-destructive behavior. These incidents kept her in the headlines, reminding the public that her case was not forgotten. In interviews and statements over the years, Susan has expressed regret and sorrow. She has claimed that she loved her children and never intended to harm them, arguing that her actions were driven by despair rather than malice. Many observers, however, remain skeptical, seeing her statements as self-serving attempts to gain sympathy. Her parole eligibility date of November 2024 has generated significant debate. For some, the idea of her release is unbearable. Given the magnitude of her crime, victims' rights advocates argue that her sons never had a chance at life, and therefore Susan should never have a chance at freedom. Others, though fewer in number, suggest that 30 years of imprisonment may represent a sufficient punishment. They point to her troubled background and psychological struggles as mitigating factors. Still, public opinion overwhelmingly leans toward keeping her behind bars for life. The Susan Smith case has often been compared to other high-profile cases of maternal filicide. For example, in 2001, Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children in Texas, citing postpartum psychosis. Unlike Susan, Andrea's defense centered on severe mental illness, and she was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity. Similarly, the case of Casey Anthony in 2008 drew comparisons. Anthony was accused of killing her daughter, Kaylee, and lying about her disappearance. Although acquitted of murder, Anthony was widely condemned in the court of public opinion. What made Susan's case stand out was the combination of her elaborate deception, the racial dimension of her false accusation, and the cold detail of strapping her children into their seats before releasing the car. Her actions embodied not only murder but betrayal of her children, her community, and the entire nation. These comparisons highlight the different ways society interprets crimes committed by mothers. Some are viewed through the lens of mental illness, others as acts of cold calculation. Susan Smith's case continues to straddle both categories, making it one of the most debated and haunting examples in American criminal history. The Smith case underscored the need for greater awareness of maternal mental health. Many argued that if Susan had received proper counseling and support earlier in life, the tragedy might have been avoided. Her story served as a warning about the dangers of untreated trauma and depression. It also forced America to confront issues of race and prejudice. By inventing a black suspect, Sue exploited systemic biases, placing innocent men in danger and feeding harmful stereotypes. This element of the case became an enduring lesson in how quickly racial fears can be manipulated. Finally, the case reflected the cultural weight of motherhood in America. Mothers are often idealized as paragons of selflessness and unconditional love. When a mother betrays that expectation in such a violent way, the societal reaction is one of shock, anger, and confusion. The Smith case tore through that idealized image, leaving behind a more complicated picture of human nature. Today, nearly 3 decades after the murders, the Susan Smith case remains a point of reference in discussions of true crime, psychology, and justice. Documentaries, books, and podcasts continue to revisit the tragedy, each attempting to unravel the mystery of why it happened. For many, the case symbolizes the darkest possibility within family life that those who are supposed to protect can sometimes destroy. The community of Union, South Carolina, still bears the scars. The monument at John D. Long Lake stands as both a memorial and a warning. Visitors pause at the site to reflect not just on the loss of 2 young lives, but on the fragility of trust and the enduring impact of violence. As Pearl approaches, Susan's fate will once again dominate headlines. Whether she is released or denied freedom, the debate will reignite, reminding Americans of a crime they cannot forget. The names Michael and Alexander Smith will continue to echo, symbols of innocence stolen by a mother's devastating choice. The Susan Smith case is more than a true crime story. It is a lens through which we examine human psychology, societal prejudice, and cultural expectations of motherhood. It teaches us the importance of mental health care, especially for women navigating trauma and motherhood. It reminds us of the dangers of racial scapegoating and how lies rooted in prejudice can harm entire communities. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, love, and the potential for darkness within ordinary lives. Ultimately, the tragedy of Susan Smith is the story of Michael and Alexander, 2 children whose lives were cut short before they could truly begin. Remembering them, rather than their mother's infamy, is the most important legacy. Their memory calls us to build a society more attentive to compassion, justice, and the quiet cries for help that often go unheard.